This episode is brought to you by Ursa Minor Outfitters. Folks, I'm absolutely in love with my loon mug. It's handmade, it's an absolute piece of art. Whether it's at the office or at the house, people keep asking to check it out. If you're not a loon fan, they also have other beautiful mugs for wildlife fans of moose, bears, and eagles. They specialize in products highlighting the outdoors and local pride through quality design by local artists. They've even started expanding into items beyond mugs, like apparel, dog accessories, and soon candles and more. They also try to partner and highlight other small businesses, and in some cases, forego profits in lieu of charitable giving to help their community, such as the dog rescue. So check them out, UrsaMinorOutfitters.com, and enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. And for our four-legged hiking partners, they also have a portable silicone dog bowl and also a sweet over-the-collar dog bandana. Go check them out, UrsaMinorOutfitters.com, and don't forget to enter promo code HikesMikes10 at checkout to receive 10% off your order. Welcome everyone to the Hikes and Mikes podcast. I'm your host Ivan, and together we'll embark on a weekly journey connecting with extraordinary hikers from all corners of the United States and beyond. Throughout these fall months, we've had the privilege of conversing with some remarkable individuals. Their experiences and adventures will leave you yearning to hit the trails. In this week's episode, we're talking to an inspirational thru hiker and mountain climber. His name is Steven, aka Near Miss when he's on the trails. You can follow him on Instagram at Paul_Bunyan_214. In this action-packed episode, we talked to Steven about his experiences both on the Appalachian Trail and Continental Divide Trail. He also shares with us some of his mountain climbing experiences both in Ecuador and Argentina, including summiting the highest point in South America. Without further ado, let's jump into this episode with our guest, Steven. Welcome, everyone, to the latest episode of the Hikes and Mikes podcast. I have a really exciting guest with me today. His name is Steven. He's going to be sharing about some of his epic journeys across some of the most popular thru hikes in America and some of the most epic peaks here in Colorado, as well as some of his upcoming journeys and quests that he's on. Steven, thank you so much for joining us on the podcast. We always like to start off by asking our guests to share a little bit about themselves and how they got started hiking.
Sure. Hey, thanks for having me. I really appreciate it. Yeah, so my name's Steven. I'm 45, so I'm a little bit on the older side. And I recently just got into thru hiking probably like 2 years ago. I grew up mainly on the East Coast, North Carolina, Rhode Island, Ohio, and then joined the Army back in 1999. And did 24 years, retired in 2023 out of Fort Stewart, Georgia. And during my transition period out of the military, I wanted to take some time off and decompress, kind of just look back through some life experiences and whatnot. And I didn't want to rush into a job right away. So I looked around for things that I could do as like a gap year, and hiking the Appalachian Trail came up on my radar. Started doing some research on it back in June of 2022 and made my final decision before I stepped away out of the Army in October of 2022. And that's really how I got started in thru hiking. I've always had a love for, I guess, adrenaline or excitement. I was airborne in the military, so jumped out of planes a lot. I did some other things deployment-wise, Iraq, Afghanistan, Syria. And then I've always had a dream of climbing Mount Everest, I think, since I was, maybe a teenager, somewhere around there, and just watch shows, 14 Peaks, the documentary with Nims Purja. And then, of course, there was a Discovery Channel show, Everest, back in the day that I watched. John Krakauer's book, the whole gamut. And that's really what, I wanted to start doing some high altitude mountaineering as well. And I figured that training on the Appalachian Trail would help to maybe transition into that later on. So that's kind of the backstory of how I got from military to thru hiker.
Well, I appreciate your years of service, Steven, and what a way to do a gap year to do the AT. I'm wondering, did you have any prior backpacking experience before you did the AT, or how did you end up getting into backpacking?
Yeah, so I guess the only backpacking experience I had is when we went to the field in the military, where you pack up all your stuff and you go live out in the woods and train for a week or a couple of weeks at a time. I was in Boy Scouts when I was younger, so a little bit there, but never, an overnight trip is what I had under my belt before I actually started through hiking, which might not be the preferred way to just jump into the water and try it. But, I figured, hey, I'm not getting any younger. It's time to start it. So if that's what I really wanted to do, that's what I was going to do.
Yeah, and it's led you on an amazing path. And before we get into not just hiking the AT but the CDT, I wanted to ask you. You're originally based out of the East Coast, and now you're based in Colorado. How would you describe the hiking scene on the East Coast, and then now that you're in Colorado, the hiking scene there?
Yeah, I would say it's pretty different. Elevation wise, number one, Colorado is mostly above 6,000 feet, pretty much the entire state. And then a lot of the trails go up to 12, 13, 14,000 feet. Out on the East Coast, it's more lush, it's more green, there's more vegetation, there's humidity, it can be wetter. In Colorado, it's typically drier, except during monsoon season, which is generally May to around August. And almost without fail, every day there will be some type of hailstorm or rainstorm right around 3 o'clock. And you have to deal with that weather, on the Colorado Trail and then on the CDT, depending on when you're going through Colorado at that point. But the hiking scenes they're different. The topography is different. The ecological systems are different. The views that you get are different. From what I saw from Georgia through the Smokies, North Carolina, Tennessee, you're not above tree line a lot of that time. You're right at tree line, and you might go to a summit that's still in trees, and then you get some views, and then you hike back down. And it seems like it was a lot of, PUDs, a lot of up and down on the East Coast hiking, right? Versus I think out here in Colorado, you kind of gain a ridge and you'll just stay on that ridge for a while, which reminded me in Virginia, it's similar like that too. Virginia seemed like it was all ridge lines going through that state.
Yeah, and I feel like that year in 2023 was an extremely pivotal year for you in hiking and through hiking, because not only did you check off the AT, but you also did the Colorado Trail shortly after. Folks should go and check out your AT entries on the trek.co, because you were able to blog and share about your experiences. For folks and our listeners, can you share a little bit about how that AT kind of came into your sights and the journey itself, and maybe some memorable moments on the trail?
I think it was back in 2013 or 2014. I was getting ready for another deployment, and you have to go through this process called soldier readiness processing. It's a medical evaluation, financial kind of stuff. You finalize a will, your life insurance, all that good stuff that might happen if you're deployed. And going through the medical evaluation, there's a questionnaire that you have to answer. I was like, you know what? I'm going to answer this honestly for the first time in my career, because typically you just check it off. I'm feeling great, whatever. Just get me through the line so I can move on with my day. And I answered some of the questions honestly. And then I had to go see like a PA kind of psych professional and got diagnosed with PTSD at that point, which I pretty much knew that I had it from previous deployments and whatnot. And that was just the culmination of saying, okay, yeah, you actually have this condition. 2014, check, got it. And she even asked me, she's like, hey, if you don't want to go on this deployment, you don't have to. Like, I can put some stuff in there. And I said, no, that's not going to happen. I'm going no matter what. And then fast forward to 2022, when I was getting ready to get out of the military, and I had remembered reading about Earl Schaefer and how he had hiked the war off through hiking through the Appalachian Trail. And that was another reason why it came on my radar too, is I thought, hey, this would be good for me mentally, emotionally, physically, spiritually, to kind of process things that happened to me, done during the years in the military, and just that transition, because it's also, you're losing an identity at the same time when you get out after 24 years. It's like, okay, I've been this person for the majority of my life. Who am I without a uniform? What am I about? What are my interests? Kind of tapping back into that at the same time, because the military does just overarching kind of rule your life during those periods. So yeah, that was another reason why too. And then when I finally decided to start the journey, I wanted to choose mentors, people that had done it before that I could lean on and talk to throughout the process, just to bounce ideas off of them, gear and whatnot, and how to through hike, how to get your body adjusted for it. So I chose one that had completed the trail in '08, who had a great perspective. Another person that had done it recently in like 2020, I think, and I met him on LinkedIn. And then I met a through hiker that had just completed it in 22 when I was shopping for gear at REI. So I kind of gathered those three as like the three wise men, as like a council that I could bounce ideas off of and just make sure, compass check wise, like I wasn't going off the rails or anything. It was really interesting too, because the one who had done it in '08, he told me, he's like, look, don't even try and crush big miles when you start. Just start off slow, nothing above 15, I would say, for the first couple of weeks, and just let your body get adjusted to it. So I got to Springer Mountain Shelter the first day, which was my first endpoint, at like noon, and no one else was there. And I started at the steps at the base of Amicalola, probably like around 6 a.m., got up to Springer Mountain, and I just sat there until people started showing up around 2 and 3 and 4. And they're like, hey, are you going to stay here tonight? Are you going to go on? And I said, yeah, I'm staying here. My body felt like I could do more, but I also knew at the same time it was a bad decision to do more. So I did just kind of like rein in the brakes a little bit and slowed down. And then the next day made it to Hawk Shelter. And it was kind of the same process. It's like, hey, are you going forward? Because Hawk Shelter was only 8 miles away and people were showing up and then leaving. And it was hard to do that in the first, I'd say, week and a half, but it was good, because I didn't have any injuries until when I was climbing off of Blood Mountain. We were descending off of that, and I rolled my ankle like really bad. It blew up. It got black and blue. Yeah, I had to take a 0 right after that. And I was legitimately concerned that I might not make it past that point, but just continuing ice, compression, elevation, and just trying to take care of it as much as possible. And it healed up. Eventually, your ankles get so strong, you roll them, and it's like, yeah, whatever. It doesn't even phase you anymore. But in the beginning, it's pretty painful when you start rolling them.
So you only took 1 0 day and then just, rest, ice, and compression, and you were able to get back on there?
Yeah, I got back on because we came off of Blood Mountain, and then I stayed at Above the Clouds, which is actually behind Blood Mountain. So it was kind of interesting because everyone hadn't gone over Blood yet, but I had. And I was taking a 0 there, and they were getting ready to go over Blood. But yeah, I just took a day off. I rested it as much as possible, iced it. I remember the next hostel that we took a 0 at was around the bend in Hiawassee, and then took another 0 there, and it was still black and blue, and it was painful. Just kept going, I guess.
Now, Stephen, one thing that really caught my attention about your experience on the AT, and, I hear about the bears and, the rodents on the AT sometimes, but you encountered quite a bit of snakes like early on, right?
Yeah, there was a lot of snakes. I don't know if that's typical or not, but there were a ton in North Carolina and Tennessee, and a lot in Virginia. And then in PA, it was a lot of rattlesnakes and black snakes too. There was actually a rattlesnake that was going across the trail, and it was kind of hidden behind a rock when I was in PA. And as I'm approaching up to that point, I could hear the rattle that it was making with its tail. And I kind of slowed down and tried to find it. I thought maybe it was somewhere off trail. Walked a little bit further, and sure enough, it was just right behind a rock, just slithering, doing its thing, going across the trail. So it's just trying to let me know, like, hey, I'm here. Don't step on me. They hide pretty well.
I'm extremely colorblind, so I purposely will avoid Eastern Washington during the summer just because they naturally blend into the environment. And me being colorblind just, adds another layer where I might not be able to see them. Hopefully, they'll let me know that they're there, but in the event that they don't, definitely want to give them their space.
Oh, yeah.
Now, Stephen, one thing that I've heard a lot about when it comes to the AT is just the support that folks give you both on and off the trail, especially when it comes to trail magic. Are there any moments of trail magic that kind of stick out for you on that trip?
Yeah, a lot, actually. I'll try and give you like maybe the top 3. The first one, we were at Gooch Mountain Shelter. There was probably a group of us, like maybe 20 or 25 that were at the shelter that night. So it was pretty crowded. And it was early in the beginning because I started in February 16th. So this is maybe the 18th or 19th, like 3 or 4 days in. So it was still kind of chilly, right? Early February in Georgia. And then 2 gentlemen were walking up to the shelter, and they didn't have normal backpacks on. They were just carrying like a knapsack backpack. And everyone was kind of looking around like, all right, what are these, guys doing here? And they came up and they passed out Gatorades, Mountain Dews, Dr. Peppers. And they said, this is the anniversary when we started our through hike in 2020. They did it during COVID. which was so cool because they had some really crazy stories that they were telling us. But it was Oso and Big Sky were their trail names. And they came out, gave us sodas, Gatorade, and then they took down everyone's order that was at the shelter, and they brought Waffle House out to us at Gooch Mountain at the actual pass. Yeah.
No way.
Yep, they took down everyone's order, brought us Waffle House. Then when we got to the pass, they had set up like a fire pit. They had beer, sodas, coffee, orange juice, the whole thing. It was amazing. It was so cool that they did that. That's the very first trail magic actually that I got on the AT was that day. So I took a Yingling with me and then brought it up to Blood Mountain. Had a Yingling on Blood Mountain with 4 or 5 other hikers that were around at the time, which is really cool. And I wanted to start this thing where every time that you pass the state's high point on the trail, I would drink a beer or have like a summit beer. But then I realized the beer weighs 12 ounces and it's kind of heavy and you're carrying it for 4 and 5 days at a time. So I was like, yeah, I'm not going to do that anymore. So that just kind of went by the wayside. And then the other memorable one is when I had Fresh Ground. So Fresh Ground is like the famous guy that goes out on the AT, sets up and cooks dinner and breakfast for people that are going through. He'll pick a spot and you never know when it's going to be. He doesn't even know when he wakes up in the morning where he's going to set up at. He just drives to a spot, sets up, and then, feeds hikers as they're coming through. Whether it's a day hiker, a section hiker, through hiker, doesn't matter. He'll feed everyone. So we were in Virginia and we were getting ready to go out to McAfee Knob. And it was a pretty long day. We were trying to do 20 or 25 miles. And there's a shelter that's just past this valley and parking lot that you have to ascend back up. And then we were going to spend the night at that shelter. So I was the first one in our group that was getting done for the day, almost to the shelter, descending down to the parking lot trailhead area. And I could see this blue canopy tent in a white van. That's Fresh Ground. Fresh Ground drives a white van and he's got this blue canopy tent that he sets up wherever he goes. And we hadn't had him on the AT, but had watched where he was going along the way. So I was descending down. I was like, I yelled out, "Is that Fresh Ground?" And people started cheering that we're down there already, eating stuff and having a nice day. So got down there. He immediately fed me like this huge burrito. Then he made these fries. I mean, he just stuffs you full of food. His goal is like to try and get people to not hike because they're so full. What I did appreciate about it is that he didn't give out sodas, anything like high and sugary or caffeine stuff. He had coffee, but it was mostly Gatorade, water. He was very hygienic. He makes you wash your hands, before you start digging into the food so no one's going to get sick. But he's set up to do, he did deep fried bacon, these homemade fries, this mac and cheese thing. And then he tells you, if you spend the night here, I'm cooking breakfast for you too. It makes your decision pretty easy. All right, I'm spending the night here. And then when the rest of my tramley started coming down, I told him he's here. And I was like, I'm setting up. I'm not going any further. If you guys want to, you can. And they all decided to set up too, which was awesome because we knew a bunch of other people that were there at the same time. And then he brought out a laptop and let us watch movies at night while he was getting all his stuff prepped for tomorrow. And he had to go run into town to the grocery store and buy some more stuff. So yeah, that was definitely a memorable one for sure.
What an incredible person for doing that. Stephen, how many years has he been doing it that you know of?
Oh, wow. I think he's been doing it 10 or 12 years, at least a decade. I mean, he's iconic on the AT. Everyone wants to get Fresh Ground. And how he does it is he starts out early with the, February hikers that start Nobo early in the season. He tries to feed them on their way up to like Virginia, where it's pretty much easy to start, getting your own resupply then. Because in the beginning, it is a little bit difficult. There's some stretches that it's pretty long, especially if you're not doing big miles. It takes 4 or 5 days to get from town to town. And then we asked him like, okay, where's the highest that you've, given out trail magic at? And he said, I've gone all the way up to Katahdin. I've given out trail magic on Katahdin. He's done trail magic on the CDT. A matter of fact, he was out on the CDT this year, but I missed him. I wasn't in the area that he was at that time. And I think he's done it on the PCT too. Yeah, he's iconic.
Now, you kind of mentioned it, but you did develop a trail family there. How long did it take you to kind of form that? And, I think our listeners, one of their number one questions that they'd want me to ask is, what was your trail name and the origin story behind it?
Yeah, so I'll give the trail name one first because it's not that epic or anything. My trail name is Near Miss, and I didn't have one almost all the way up to Virginia. And I was with a guy, Redline was his trail name, and we were hiking together, and I had like a bad fall descending down into Damascus. And it almost was pretty catastrophic and probably could have ended my through hike. And I was okay. And he was like, dude, that's a near miss, man. So it just kind of stuck after that point because I hadn't had a trail name up to that. So the Tramley one, I hiked with really 3 different Tramleys throughout the entirety of the AT. The first ones I met right at Springer Mountain, and then we hiked together all the way through the Smokies, and then they had to get off for some different things. I hiked alone for a while until I met Redline going into Virginia. And then we linked up with a gentleman and his 2 sons, and then a girl named Sriracha, who was, she was doing a gap year between undergrad and grad school. And then us 6 hiked together pretty much all the way through Virginia. We stayed together. And then Troy and his kids, his trail name's Rocksteady, and then his kids were Pop Tart and Almost. They had a different timeline that they had to finish at because one of them was getting ready to go back to college. They had to finish quicker than when I wanted to finish. So we kind of all split up after Virginia. And then I hiked alone through PA, Connecticut, Massachusetts, New York, New Jersey, all the way through Vermont until New Hampshire. And then I met a guy named Hardy Soul, who's a retired Navy E9, just like me, Army E9. And he was also a cop in Michigan. He's a retired police officer too. So we started hiking together just because we had similar backgrounds. And then we met up with a guy named Double D, who was Dr. Danger, but we named him Double D instead. But he was a retired naval dentist, '06 in the Navy. So then it was us 3 that pretty much finished through New Hampshire into Maine together on Katahdin.
And I know it's probably a lot of emotions came, flooding in once you make it to Katahdin. But what was it like finishing the AT after spending all those weeks and months on the trail?
Yeah, I mean, I remember I got up to this, I was sobbing a little bit when I got up to the sign, and it's a relief, but it was kind of like, okay, what do I do now? And I think if you don't have that plan in place, it's hard to adjust back to life coming off of the AT, because the very next day I woke up and I just felt like I needed to be doing something, like packing up my tent or getting ready to hike for the day or go over the map or, something like that. And that gap was kind of there. So definitely a relief. It was the most memorable experience, one of that I've had in my life. All the days of just walking through mud or wet or being wet, cold, tired, hungry, it just all comes to culmination at that moment. And I was lucky enough that my brother, who's also retired military, flew out to summit Katahdin with me. So it was me, him, Hardy Soul's wife was there, Missy, and then Double D, he was with us as well. So all of us went up to the summit at the same time, and we went down different trails, different ways, and split off from there. But Hardy Soul actually came out and saw me on the CDT too. And then I saw Double D, he was on the CT while I was on the CDT, and we pass one another. It's such a small world in the hiking community. It's pretty cool.
You talked about that gap after you got off the AT, and one of the awesome things that you did was you went out and completed a shorter through hike, the Colorado Trail, which boasts some serious elevation gain. And I think one thing that I always find unique about the CT is that it's a shared trail. And, I hear stories of through hikers that either had to dive off the trail because of mountain bikers bombing the hill. How was it choosing the CT, the Colorado Trail, after the AT? How did that kind of come about?
Yeah, so I met a guy in PA, trail named 700. And 700, the AT was his Triple Crown. And we were just chatting back and forth one day. And I mentioned, I'm not too sure. I didn't have a plan of what I was going to do afterwards. And he just straight up said, go do another through hike, man. You're in shape for it right now. Just don't stop the momentum. He was trying to convince me to go Sobo on the CDT. When I finished off the AT, I was like, I think that's a little bit too much for me at this point. But, Colorado Trail, that's kind of manageable. I could probably fit that in. That's how that came about. And then I did take some time off. I took like maybe a week and a half off in transition, got back out to Colorado, packed up all my stuff, and then started off on the Colorado Trail. It ties back into getting ready for other adventures later on that year, because Everest was on the radar, I try to get mentors when I'm doing something because they're the subject matter experts, people that have already done it before to bounce ideas and compass checks off. And I met an individual through my brother who had already done the 7 summits. And we talked to him even before I started the AT. And we were like, hey, we want to do Everest. We'd love to partner up with you. We know you have your own company. It's called Dash Adventures. He leads treks all around the world on different peaks. He basically told us, what high altitude mountaineering experience do you have? And we both didn't really have any. And he was like, well, first step is you got to go to Ecuador. That's the first cog in the wheel there to get you some experience above, I'd say, 15,000 feet to see, one, if your body can handle it anatomically, and then two, just to get used to doing glaciated peaks and whatnot. So that was on my radar as well. And I didn't want to get out of shape. So that was another reason to stay active through that point on the CT. And then, yeah, that's how it came about, really.
How was it dealing with not just the elevation, but the elevation gain of the CT compared to the AT?
It's weird because the AT, the PUD, the pointless up and down, it's like, okay, why am I walking over here when I could have just walked right over there and not had another gain of 1,500 feet? Like, what is the purpose of that? On the CT, the only time you're going up is to get to a ridge, go over a pass, maybe a traverse, across a certain area. The elevation was harder because, you're higher. You're above 6,000 all the way up to 12, 13,000. And it took a little bit to get used to it, to be honest with you. The highest I think I had been before that point was like 12,500, and that's skiing at Breckenridge, but you're not up there hiking. You go up to the top and then you ski back down. So it was different handling the altitude at that point, getting used to the idea that your body is going to move differently at that altitude, but also how you're going to breathe, how you're going to eat, managing altitude sickness if you get any of it, like vertigo or headaches or things of that nature. Of course, you're going to get loss of breath because that's just normal. But there's other things that come about that, if you're experiencing those, you really need to climb down, and get to a lower altitude. I do have one memorable story on CT with mountain bikers. So they were doing this crazy endurance ultra marathon mountain bike race when I was on the CT, and it was going up to the pass of Breckenridge, dropping down into that town. And I remember I camped at a campsite, and I didn't realize that the race was going on until I woke up that day and I saw these mountain bikers going through my campsite, and I could hear them coming down. They ring, they're like, on your left, they yell. And sometimes some of them are good. They're really courteous with it, but these people were in a race. So they were going for time. And I don't think courtesy was one of the things that were on their mind at that point. So you really had to have your head like on a swivel. You couldn't have your both earbuds in, definitely only one, trying to listen, because you can hear the bike as it's coming down or see it on switchbacks and whatnot. And one of the people that I was talking to that was taking a break, he's like, oh yeah, there's world-class athletes out here right now. One of them, a female, passed me going up to this ridge. She was carrying her bike. They pretty much like walk and carry their bike up to the pass, and then they descend down on the bike. And I was just flat out amazed. And she was moving, like she was cooking it. And he's like, yeah, she's a beast. I can't remember her name, but she was out there and she was crushing it for sure. And they had just started maybe 3 or 4 days ago. So they were already at Breckenridge at that point. That's pretty far. It's a couple 100 miles.
Oh, that's wild.
Yeah. There are bikers all over that trail though. It's sometimes, I'll be honest, it's nothing against mountain bikers, but having hikers and mountain bikers on the same trail at the same time, it can be problematic. You definitely have to be aware and cognizant of what's going on around you for both parties, because accidents do happen and it's hard for them to stop when they're going downhill. And if you're not getting out of the way, they could plow you over.
Steven, you mentioned it already, but Ecuador. And once I got to your feed of not just Ecuador, but also your trek to Argentina, you saw some beautiful landscapes in both of those countries, and you were able to climb some impressive peaks. I think most of them were either above 18,000, and I think there was a 20,000 footer on that list. How did those trips kind of come about, and what was it experiencing those mountains in both Ecuador and Argentina?
Yeah, so Ecuador was really the first step to see if Everest is even attainable for me, to test my body above 15,000 feet. because anatomically, some people, their body can't handle the altitude, right? Even if they take the medicine, it's not in the cards. So that really was my first step. So that trip was with Dave Ashley, the guy I mentioned, Dash Adventures. Flew into Quito, met up with them. The first day is just kind of going over your gear, checking over everything, making sure you have the appropriate gear, crampons, double boots, ice axe, stuff like that, heavy gloves, heavy puffy. And then the next day was our first acclimation hike, which was to an extinct volcano called Pasachoa, and it goes up to about 13,000 feet. And Quito's at 9,000 feet. So I think we started like around 10 or 11,000 feet, went up to 13, came back down. Then the next day you do Ruca Pincha, which you took a tram from Quito up to 13,000 feet. So you go up from 9 to 13 in like 10 minutes, 4,000 feet that you gain. It was pretty crazy. And on that hike, Dave really worked with me and he kind of showed me, okay, this is how you have to move at this altitude to conserve energy, because that's what it's really about. How he explained it is, you have a body battery and you want to keep that body battery in the green zone until summit day. And then you basically exhaust that body battery, getting to the top and getting back down, which made a lot of sense to me. So he started showing me rest step technique, how to walk in deep scree fields, how to descend in scree, a little bit of hand over hand climbing kind of stuff. And then the next day we drove out and climbed up to a refugio at Ilanitza Norte and Ilanitza Sur. So this used to be one major volcano. And then I think like 10 million years ago or something, it blew apart and split into two separate peaks. So there's Sur and then there's Norte, which is south and north. And we did Norte. Sur is the harder one, and it's usually glaciated. But when we did it, there was no ice on it whatsoever. So it makes it even more technical and difficult. But Norte was up to 16,000 feet. And you just get like this amazing view of Cotopaxi off in the distance. And it had smoke coming from the caldera. And it was all, snow covered down to the tree line. It was epic. It was so cool on that one. Then you hike back down to the refugio and then you hike out of the park. Then we took a day off and then we transitioned over to Kiambe. And Kiambe is interesting because it's the highest point closest to space on Earth. You would think it's Everest, but it's actually Kiambe because it's on the equator. And Kiambe is only 19,000 feet, so it's higher, closer to space than Everest is because Everest is not near the equator. It's pretty interesting. The equator actually passes through the right side of Kiambe on the eastern edge. So we drove out to the refugio for that one. We had a glacier skills class, which was awesome. You're just basically throwing yourself around in snow all day, working with crampons on a rope team, using your ice axe, walking over crevasses, getting comfortable with that. That was a really fun day. And then we went to bed and then got up at midnight that same night, I guess, and then started out for the summit of Kiambe. And I remember when we started, it was warm, but it was also snowing at the same time. It was really bizarre, but we stripped down to like t-shirts because it was so warm and this is midnight, up at like 15,000 feet, walking around in t-shirts on a glacier. Eventually, once we got to the glacier, our guide, Ramel, was like, hey, you got to put your stuff on now. Like, you can't be just going up in a t-shirt. Come on. You got to put some layers on. So we layered up, and that's when you rope up together. And then you start up towards the summit. And it took us probably about 5 or 6 hours to make the summit at that point, and then to come back down. The summit was super windy and really, really cold. It's up to 19,500, I think is what it was. And then, descending back down. I remember walking by this crevasse that was on my left side as we're traversing across up to the summit. And I looked down into it and I couldn't see a bottom and I could smell sulfur coming out of it. I was like, yeah, that's a deep one. If you fall into that thing, you're going all the way down to the bottom for sure. And then we drove back from Kiambe, took another day off, and then we went out to Chimborazo. And on Chimborazo, you first climb up to high camp. So you start at a trailhead like around 15,000 feet, climb up to 17,500 or 17,700, camp the night there, and then you start off for your summit bid. And then Chimborazo goes up to like 20,500, I think is what it was. But it has like this really, it's this horrible false summit. So you're just climbing up this steep glaciated side of the mountain pretty much the whole time until you crest finally to the top of the summit. You think it's the summit, it's the false summit. You get up to the top, and then the true summit is maybe another mile away, but you can see it. It's this snow mound that's off in the distance. And I'm like, oh God, man. But you have to descend and then reascend back up to the summit. And most, believe it or not, most people just got to that point and were like, yep, I'm good. I'm going back down. And they didn't even go over to the true summit. So me, because me and Ramel were climbing together, and then Dave and his partner Shelly, they were climbing together with another guy that we had, Marquito. So we were all three on the, all five of us were on the mountain at the same time. But Ramel took the rope off, unhooked us, and he's like, okay, all we got to do is, walk over to the summit. That's it. So got over there and, sat down, just kind of took it all in that I was that high and had made it up there, and drank some tea. At that point, it was cold tea, but I hoped whatever I was drinking would help me out. That was my first real high altitude experience, because I hadn't been above 14,000 feet because I started doing some 14ers before that trip in preparation for it. But yeah, that's the highest I'd ever been, in 19 and then 20,000. And then it showed me that it is possible for me to really try and attempt some of these other high altitude peaks, like 7,000 meter or 8,000 meter peaks. And that gave me the confidence that my body's going to hold up as long as I'm in good shape and I take care of it and follow that methodology of the body battery and trying to conserve energy and walking at a certain type of pace. I mean, you're not going to do a through hike, 3.5 mile hour pace at those altitudes. It's not possible. There's a thing called rest step, where you take a step and you kind of wait a couple seconds and then you take another step. And then that's how you just kind of repeat it just like that. And honestly, I like that kind of climbing because it gets me in like this meditative state where all I'm focused on is the next step, the next breath. It's a lot of hyper focus. It's funny too, because I had always climbed or hiked or done stuff with earbuds in. And Dave, when he saw me put one earbud in, he's like, hey, you're not going to be wearing those when we go up to Yambe and Chimborazo, right? He's like, it's hard enough to hear with the wind, and you're wearing a helmet and you have a beanie on, and you can't have an earbud in at the same time. It's like, oh man. So I was like, God, this is going to suck, because I've never climbed or hiked without music or a podcast or anything before. Like, how am I going to do this? But sure enough, it was easy. I adapted pretty quickly. And now there's a couple hours out of the day when I'm hiking that I will just turn off music or a podcast and I'll just hike with nothing, just being in nature and being grounded in that moment and trying to, refocus on stuff. And the other interesting point about it too was we met with the owner of the company when we first got to Quito, and I wanted to know the mileage and the elevation gain for each day. Like, that's all I wanted to know. That's what I was fixated on. And I asked him, I said, hey, I see on the brochure it just says 6 to 7 hours. Like, can we get the distances and elevation gain? And he straight up said, he's like, nope, you don't need it. You don't need it. Just follow the guide. That's all you got to do. And it was so frustrating to me, because like, that's how I had done my whole AT hike. Is I sit down in my tent at the end of the day, I look over the map, I look at the elevation gain. When's this climb? When do I need nutrition? When can I take a lunch break? Just kind of planning it out. And that was the rhythm that I had. So going into a hike and not knowing that, it was a little frustrating at first. But then, by the second or third hike, I was cool with it. It didn't even matter anymore. And then do you want me to go into Argentina now, or do you want me to wait on that one? Because I'll jump right into that one too.
Jump right into it.
So got back from Ecuador and then right away made my trip for Aconcagua, which is one of the 7 summits. It's the highest point in the Western Hemisphere and the highest point outside the Himalayas. It tops out at like 23,000 feet. It's pretty much a 7,000 meter peak. It's about a 2-week expedition. The company I used was top notch. It was amazing. I actually was supposed to link up with Dave and Shelly on that trip as well, and we were going to climb together. But they had something happen and they couldn't make that one, so they pushed it back to a different year. So it was me solo that went down there. And then I flew in through Peru into Mendoza, and then met up with Diego, who was our guide for the expedition. And then there was a girl, Jordan, who had already done all the 58 14ers, which was awesome that she was on our expedition because she was a beast. She knew a lot more than me and had done other peaks in Bolivia. She had already done Kilimanjaro, Kiambe, and Chimborazo. So she had a lot of experience underneath her belt. And then there was a group of Swedish gentlemen that were from Sweden that came over, and they just wanted to do Sierra Bonnet, which is one of the acclimation hikes that you do while you're in the expedition. And then we had a group of local Argentinians that just wanted to go up to the Confluencia, which is the first camp you go to, and do one of the day hikes there. So it was all of us in one big group. I met Nims Persia at the hotel there and took a picture with him. I got to chat with him a little bit and just kind of pick his brain and ask him, hey, were you really hungover on Kakinjungwa like it said on Netflix? Is that really the way it worked? He was like, dude, I couldn't even put on my socks the right way. Like, it was a horrible day. He's a beast for sure.
Did he climb in there in Argentina? Or?
Oh, yeah. Yeah. He was leading an expedition. So his own company, Elite Exped, that was like his group that he was out there leading with. So he had maybe, I don't know, 20 or 30 clients with him that were doing Aconcagua at the same time. Same process as Ecuador. They check your gear. They make sure you have all the right stuff. You pack everything up, and then they drive you out to a point where you drop off a couple of your bags, and then they get loaded onto mule trains. And then mules will bring them up to all the way up to base camp. So then you hike from the start of the park out to what's called Confluencia. And Confluencia is about 11,000 feet. You stay there for a few days. There's a hike to the south face of Aconcagua, which you get to see the glacier. It's the prettier side of the mountain, basically. So we went there, hung out for the day, just like took a nap, around 14,000 feet, and then hiked back over to the Confluencia, had a 0 day, and then we hiked over to base camp. A couple of the Swedish gentlemen started experiencing some altitude sickness, so they had to kind of diddy mile off the mountain. But the rest of us stayed there. We did Sierra Bonnet, which was another 5,000 meter peak. It's like 16,000 feet or something like that for an acclimation hike. And then the rest of the Swedish gentlemen left. And then it was just me, Jordan, and Diego. And at that point, we spread apart like all our food that we had to carry, all our gear. And then you start shuttling up gear to Camp 1. Camp 1 is at 16,000, 17,000 feet around there. So you hike up to Camp 1, you drop off some gear, but then you stay there for a couple hours, trying to get some acclimation. And then you go back down to base camp. You take one more day off, and then you start your trek up for your summit bid. So we went back up to Camp 1, spent the night there, went over to Camp 2 the next day. Camp 2 is at like 18,000 feet, slept there. And Diego came to us and he said, hey, we have an extra day built into the weather window. So if you want to take another day for acclimatization, I recommend you take it here at Camp 2 versus up at Camp 3 at like 19,800 feet. So me and Jordan both decided, yeah, let's just go ahead and take it if it's built in there, because we weren't in a rush to try and finish it. So we took an extra day at Camp 2, hung out there, and just even going to the bathroom, like walking to the bathroom at like 18,000 feet was exhausting. Like your heart rate just spikes immediately as soon as you start doing any type of physical activity. So it was definitely interesting. And, it's harder to sleep. You wake up kind of gasping for air. I've learned to sleep with like a buff over your mouth because it's so dry up at those altitudes and in those climates. That way you don't get nosebleeds or stuff like that during the night. And you're kind of breathing through it. So I don't know, it just helps for me personally. The next day, after that last rest day, we went up to Camp 3, which is like 19,800, 19,500, spent the night there, and then got up at 5 a.m. and started our summit push up to the top, up to 23,000. And we were going across a terrain feature that's called the Traverse, and it was like so cold and windy. It was probably like 30 or 40 mile per hour winds, and it was already down, I don't know, 5 or 0 degrees Fahrenheit. So with that wind chill, it had to have been -10 or -15. I remember looking down at one side of my body that was exposed, the right side that was exposed to the wind, and it had frost like all on that side of my body. And the rest, like my left side was perfectly fine, but my right side was completely frosted. And that's when Diego stopped. He turned around and stopped me and was like, your nose is frozen. We're kind of like yelling over the wind. And I was like, what? And he said, yeah, your nose is frozen. Sure enough, my buff had fallen down below my nose. The tip of my nose turned completely white, like just bright white, like a light bulb white. Yeah, it was frozen. It was pretty much frozen. So I had to like take out my right hand out of my mittens, and I had a hand warmer in there to keep my hands warm. And I like defrosted my nose with my hand warmer really quick, then put my buff back on, and then just stuck my hand back in my glove. But inadvertently, one of my fingers had gotten wet from that. And when I stuck it back in my glove, it pretty much just froze. They say it was frost nip. It's like a form of frost bite, but it went through the stages of frostbite. I lost, complete feeling in the tip. It turned black. It turned gray. The skin started to crack and come off. So I had to actually go see a hand specialist like a couple weeks after I had gotten back to see if it needed to be lanced, like cut off, if there was, any blood flow in there whatsoever, if it was just completely dead. And lucky enough, all it did was just crack off and everything, and I was able to keep it. So, but now it's susceptible to, cold conditions. Anytime it gets cold again, yeah, it's bad news. And what was funny about it is there was another guy that joined our expedition at Camp 3. This is like his third or fourth time on Aconcagua. And he had already done Vinson Massif in Antarctica. He did Denali. He's done some other big peaks. He doesn't want to do Everest. He has no interest in completing the actual 7, but he wants to continue to climb. So he goes out and does these climbs. And he was having some cardiorespiratory issues up on the top, and then descending back down, his heart rate kept spiking. They didn't get back to Camp 3 until like 2 or 3 in the morning after they left the same time we did at like 5 a.m. So it was like a 24-hour ordeal for them. But he had gotten frostbite, I think either on Denali, because I showed him my finger and I said, I think I have, something's wrong with this, because it already started looking purple and kind of grayish. I said, I think this might be frostbite. And he took off his glove and 2 or 3 of his fingers were completely black, like from the second or third knuckle all the way to the tip. And he's like, this is frostbite. What you have is called frost nip. And I looked at his fingers. I was like, oh my God, are you okay? He said that he had gotten it on previous climbs. And now whenever he's exposed too much to cold, that's what his fingers just immediately go back to it. They turn that color again. He was like, it'll be fine in like 3 or 4 weeks. It'll go away again. I was like, holy cow, that's crazy.
Oh my goodness.
Yeah.
I got to ask, how was it summiting after going through all that cold exposure and, the frost nip? How was it summiting that mountain?
That was one of the hardest things I've ever done, honestly, mentally and physically, because we got to like the last pitch called the cave. And I seriously I was like, I don't know if I have it in me to go all the way to the top. I'm pretty tired. And I knew that, getting to the top is easy. It's getting down that's hard, because there's still that really long descent that you have to do. So you still have to have some in the tank to, get up and get back down. But I decided, I'm going to gut it through it. I'm going to push my limits, and go up, and then got to the top, pretty much collapsed on the summit. It was super cold. We didn't get any views because it was all socked in with clouds, which is it's kind of disappointing when you get up, because you want to see like the whole view of the Andes. But yeah, it was definitely the hardest thing I've ever done, for sure. And it felt great to get up to the top. But then, in the back of my mind, I'm like, all right, now you have to get down. There's still a portion. It's not done. There's still a long way to go to get back down to Camp 3. And believe it or not, there was a dead body on the summit. Somebody had a heart attack 2 or 3 days before we did our summit push, and they hadn't removed the body yet. So it was still up there. And Diego didn't tell us about it until like pretty much the last minute that it was up there, because I don't think he wanted it to mess with our mental head game or focus. So, but yeah, it was phenomenal. It was great getting to the top, but it was kind of like, all right, let me get back down. I'm really tired and it's hard to breathe up here.
Oh, man, Stephen, that's remarkable, man.
So it's not over from that point either. So you have to go back down to Camp 3. You spend the night there, and then you go from Camp 3 all the way back down to base camp. So you go from 19,000 back down to 14,000. But then when you're down there, basically they have like wine, they have beer, they cook you a huge meal. There's definitely a party that goes on, which is really cool. You take a shower, maybe do some laundry, refit your gear, get everything ready for the mules to take out the next day. And then you hike out of that park. So you have to go from base camp all the way out of the park, which is like a 20-mile day too. Yeah, it's a beast. Aconcagua is a beast, because there's so much that you have to, it's not just like getting to the top and then going back down to a trailhead and then you're off. There's still a long way to get out of there. Some people do pay like $750 and just take a helicopter out. But I mean, come on, you got to walk out of the park.
Yeah. Oh, man. I got to tell listeners, if you get a chance, go check out Steven's Instagram and check out the pictures both from Ecuador and Argentina. They're just absolutely remarkable. And, the journey continues, Steven, because this year you wrapped up the CDT, the second trail in the Triple Crown of thru hiking. And for me personally, I was curious, what made you decide to go with the CDT over the PCT? And if you could share a couple of the memorable moments, whether it was wildlife, trail magic, or your trail family on the CDT.
So I chose the CDT. I think it's pretty much the toughest one out of the three for the Triple Crown. A lot of people do it as their last one. And I personally wanted to do that one next because I'm living in Colorado at the current moment. So it just made sense to me, being in the same backyard. And it had a bigger allure than the PCT at this point. Plus, the PCT, from everyone that I've talked to, they say it's magical. You get views every day. And I wanted that to be my last thru hike for the triple versus the CDT or the AT. That's just me personally. That's how I kind of viewed it. Some memorable stories from the CDT. We were in the Wind River Range and we were going up to go through the high route, the Cirque du Towers. And I was coming out of this small little basin, just popped over this little hill, and there was this massive moose that was just standing there by this stream. It was like probably 30 or 40 feet away. I mean, it was huge. And it just stood there. It just stood there, looked at me, looked back at whatever he was staring at. And my hiking partner, 9 to 5, was coming up behind me. So I kind of like motioned to him and told him to be quiet and come up softly. And I pointed it out to him. And then we stood there and just kind of watched it. It didn't do anything. It was nonchalant. It could not even care that we were standing there watching it. It was just hanging out, It was a beautiful moment. That's one of my memorable points. A couple off-trail memories too. Like we had this really crazy night in Creed where we were hanging out and watching a football game, like soccer. I think it was the Copa America game. Just hanging out at a bar, drinking, having a good time. And the dude that was running the bar basically kept it open for us and was talking to us about thru hiking in Colorado. And he had done some mining work out in Creed. So listening to his stories was pretty memorable. Some of the memorable trail magic was a trail named Bee God out at Pagosa Springs actually came, picked us up, brought us to his house, cooked us dinner, let us stay there. Him and his wife, he has like a homestead area where he keeps bees. He's like a beekeeper. That's where he got his trail name, Bee God. He's got his own pottery studio, and then cooked us breakfast in the morning. That was an awesome experience. He was really, really cool because he had done parts of the CT2 back in his younger days. And we were asking him about thru hiking and stuff. And he's like, yeah, I mean, I have much respect for you guys doing it, but I'm not doing it at my age now, because he was a little bit older, I think in his 60s, but he still gets out there and hikes too. Those are probably the two most memorable that stick out in my mind. I'm sure there's tons more. The CDT is, it's so much different than the AT because there's no shelters. The infrastructure is very limited. It's a lot of hitchhiking, a lot more than I ever did on the AT. Because there's really not shuttle drivers in a lot of these towns. It's mostly just hitchhiking from Trailhead, into town and then back to the Trailhead. Another example is like on the AT, if you're going to stay at a hostel, they'll sometimes include a shuttle ride from the Trailhead to pick you up and bring you back and forth, right? That's part of the cost, or you can pay for it. On the CDT, there's a hostel called the Butterfly House, and it's on the CT as well. But they're like, hey, you can walk here from the Trailhead, but that's pretty much it. Or you can hitchhike. But it's maybe a 2 or 2.5 mile walk from the Trailhead with like 3,000 feet of descent down to the pass where you got to go. But you think, okay, that's easy to get down there. But when you're leaving out of that location, you got to go back up that 2.5 miles and 3,000 feet of gain just to get to the Trailhead. That's another example of why the CDT is just so much more difficult, I think, than the AT or the PCT in general. And in Colorado, you're above altitude a lot. Wyoming, you deal with the basin, which is hot. It's really a desert. There's not a lot of water, long water carries, but there's not a lot of elevation gain either. So you can crush big miles through that. That's where everyone tries to do their 48 or 24-hour challenge to see how far they can go in that time period. And then, of course, in New Mexico, you start out in the desert. You go through Silver City and Grants or through Pie Town, Chama. There's some beautiful areas down in New Mexico as well. especially once you get out of the desert portion and you start actually seeing water. But before that, the water's pretty scarce too. It's drinking through, cow troughs and some pretty sketch water sources, but everything that I filtered and never got sick once. So
Yeah, I've heard great things about New Mexico, and there's been some places that get posted on Instagram where it's tagged as New Mexico, and I'm like, oh my gosh, had no idea it had these forests, it had these mountains, because I personally was thinking like desert, but once you get out of the desert, it's a whole nother world up there in New Mexico.
it's really beautiful. Just that desert portion is horrible in the beginning, but once you get through that, it's not that bad. The CDT does a great job too. There's water caches out there that are refilled daily. They're pretty much about every 15 or 19 miles apart, all the way to Lordsburg. And then after that, you're kind of on your own to get your own water. But in the desert portion where there is none, they definitely help you out. There's packs of coyotes at night that you can hear that howling and running by your tent. But there's nowhere to like hang your food either, which was kind of frustrating to me because I'm a pretty big proponent on hanging food and not keeping it near my tent. And in the beginning, it's like, okay, where do I put my food back? Like there's nothing out here to hang it on.
So where'd you end up finding? How'd you end up storing your food?
Probably not the best way, just like right underneath my vestibule. But I think pretty much everyone does that in the desert portion, unless you want to walk it away from you. But yeah, I just chanced it one night and I said, all right, if no coyotes come around me and try and take my food bag, then I'll just do that through this portion. Once you're out of Lordsburg, you start getting around some trees and then you can hang it properly again after that point.
Now, Stephen, I'm curious because now you have, thousands of miles under you. You have 2 long distance through hikes underneath your belt. What was the differences when it came to your pack list and maybe your pack weight between the AT and the CDT? Like what changes did you make, if there were any changes?
Yeah, great question. It's so controversial too. Pack weight and what people bring. Some people go for the comfort and they don't care about the weight, and other people are totally ultralight. On the AT, I met a guy named Lumberjack who was doing a through hike. This is his second one. He had done the CDT previously. And I was just picking his brain and asking him, do you have any advice? And he told me something that stuck with me to this day. And he said, if there's something in your pack that you haven't touched in 5 days, chuck it, because you're obviously not needing it and you're not using it. And that really holds true, because when I first started out on the AT, I was like carrying a paper map of the AT, but I also had Far Out on my phone. I had like this camp chair that I brought with me because I was like, I want to have a little camp chair at the end of the day to sit up. But there's shelters everywhere and there's logs and rocks and all this other kind of stuff to sit on. So when I got to Hiawassee, I just started chucking stuff out of my bag that I wasn't using anymore. Got rid of an extra set of clothes and got my base weight back down to like probably 18-ish pounds, right? Somewhere around there. And that's what I stayed with the whole way. So I had a Nemo 2P on the AT. I had an Enlightened Equipment 0 degree when I first started, but then switched to a 30 degree quilt later on in the year because it just got too warm for that 0 degree. I took a Nemo Tensor insulated because I wanted a hard R value, and I'm like a side sleeper. So I know people sometimes just take the Nemo like pad and just kind of lay it out. I need a little bit more cushioning. I use an Osprey. I don't use a Hyperlight or a Z-Pax. I did talk to someone that had a Hyperlight, and they basically told me, look, if you're not ultralight, it doesn't carry that well. You have to be base weight under 15 pounds for those packs to kind of jive with you. If you're up in the 20, 25 pound base weight, they're going to hurt, right? Once you start adding in food and water and stuff. So that's why I went with the Osprey Exos. But I have Z-Packs, trekking poles, electronics, stuff like that. And I carried all that stuff with me on the AT. And then when I started the CDT, I wanted to upgrade my tent. Nemo 2P was great. It was just kind of too small for me. I wanted some bigger room and I wanted it to be a little bit lighter. So I went with the Z-Packs Duplex. I switched that out, which got my base weight down even more. But then I switched my pad to a higher R value pad, the Nemo Extreme Conditions that just came out recently. But it was just as much weight as the Nemo Tensor, but it had an R value of 8. It's sick. It's crazy. I'm like sweating pretty much every night that I go to sleep now. It was awesome because I also started out with my 30 degree quilt instead of a 0 degree, and it turned my 30 degree into like a 20 degree because the R value is so high that the quilt just keeps body heat so much better. So I guess it's a sacrifice for weight, but it helps out the same way.
I'm glad you mentioned it because I converted to a quilt this year after ditching my sleeping bag, and you did too. What made you do the switch? Because for me personally, I'm a side sleeper, and I had one of those mummy sleeping bags, and it was really hard to get comfortable sleeping on my side in one of those. But with the quilt, it was a game changer, and then just being able to stuff it in my pack made it a breeze. But what made you switch over to a quilt?
Yeah, the versatility of it, being a side sleeper as well. And like the foot box, you can undo the foot box so you can close the foot box at the same time. And I learned that you can dry things out at night in your foot box as well. Like if you have, say, wet socks or a wet shirt or something like that, just stick it down in the bottom of your foot box, and the body heat that you have in there will naturally just dry it out throughout the night, which is pretty cool.
Yeah, and the other question I want to ask you is because you've done international travel with your pack. What tips or advice would you give people that are wanting to go internationally and hike and maybe backpack that they should consider when packing their pack to take on the plane?
So I bought like the little bag. Osprey makes I guess, air travel bag that you can put your pack in. So I'll put the majority of my gear in my Osprey pack and then put that in that aircraft bag. I've done that now every time that I've traveled and haven't had an issue with it. I put my trekking poles on the inside, not on the outside, in case it gets caught up on something. But I've stuck crampons in there, my ice axe, all my gear into that one small bag, and it hasn't had an issue. Now, I do have another North Face bag, which is 100-liter, and I'll put double boots, all my layers, Gore-Tex, all that kind of stuff in that bag, and any extra gear that I'm bringing as well. I typically have like 3 bags, a carry-on, that big North Face bag, and then I'll pack my actual pack with gear and put it in that aircraft travel bag, which I recommend getting one of those. Even if you don't have an Osprey, you can put your pack in the Osprey bag, or I think North Face makes one as well. Just put it in that bag, and I've never had issues with it. I've never had anything stolen out of it. I've never had equipment come back broken or anything like that. I think, the fear mongering is out there, and people get nervous when they're bringing stuff on international travel or just putting it on an airplane. They're like, how am I going to carry it on? Like, what do I do with my trekking poles? They're not going to go through security. Like, how am I going to do this? I've never had a problem checking it. Knock on wood. Watch me on my next trip. It will probably get stolen.
Check that out, because what I've been doing is I have a giant Dakine travel bag, and my backpacking bag fits in there, but it takes up like half, if not 3/4 of the storage. But being able to just put that backpack in a separate bag already packed and not have to worry about taking a larger check to luggage is clutch.
Yeah, it works out pretty well.
Now, Stephen, these last 3 questions are questions we like to ask all our guests on the podcast. And you kind of touched base on this one, but I'm interested in seeing if maybe it's changed or updated in recent months. But I feel like hikers and some backpackers have a regular summit routine or end of the hike routine. For some, it's a favorite snack or a summit beer or summit beverage. For others, it's a moment of zen or the favorite meal afterwards. Is there a regular customer routine that you do when you reach your destination or maybe when you make it back out?
On the summit, it's definitely like taking it in. Taking my headphones out, taking some pictures, and just sitting there and being in the moment and realizing where I'm at, looking at the views and trying to just focus in. I used to, the summit beer thing, I was going to try and do that the whole way, but I don't really do that much anymore. I thought about maybe bringing a flask with me in Ecuador and Argentina, but I don't want to be drinking while I'm trying to descend too on some of these hikes. So I figured I'd just wait till I get back down to base camp and then I could have a drink or something.
Hey.
In Colorado, for doing 14ers and stuff like that, when I get back down, it's always a go-to meal. And for me, it's McDonald's. I don't know why, but I just like to go crush like a 20-piece and maybe a couple Big Macs and like a chocolate shake and a large fry and just kind of stuff my face for sure. I know that's so horrible though. It's like not good for you whatsoever body-wise, but it's junk food and my body just kind of craves it after doing a hard hike like that.
Now, I'm interested in this one. Is there a luxury item that you tend to pack that falls outside of the essentials, or have you gotten your pack list down where everything's a necessity?
Yeah, I think I have kind of 2 luxury items, I guess. One is I carry a 20 milliamp Nightcore battery bank, which is on the higher side. But I wear an Apple Watch, so I charge my watch, my phone, and my earbuds all through that one power bank. So I wanted something that had the capability to do it, 4 and 5 times. So that's a pretty heavy item. I would consider that kind of a bougie one. And then I carry a beard brush to brush out my beard every morning, because that thing will just get like wicked gnarly and matted, and you got to do some upkeep and maintenance on it, or else it gets out of control, and then it's going to be harder when you get back into town. So, but the beard brush is maybe, I don't know, 6 or 7 ounces. Yeah, that's pretty much my luxury items there.
Awesome. Yeah, I think the beard brush is a necessity, is a luxury item at the same time.
Oh, yeah, it's definitely a necessity.
Now, Stephen, you've kind of touched base on this, but the adventures don't stop with the CDT. You're actually going on an amazing trip here coming up in the next few weeks, if I'm not mistaken. What travel or hiking goals do you have for the remainder of the year and for 2025?
Yeah, so for the remainder of the year, I'd like to do 5 more 14ers. To get up into the 30 count. I'm at 29 right now, and I want to, get towards that number of 58. That's all of them. And then you mentioned I'm going to Kilimanjaro in about a week. By the time this podcast comes out, I'll have already hopefully summited, and then come back. But then for the rest of the year, it's pretty much just 14ers and then transitioning over to ski season for sure. Next year, it's getting ready for an attempt at Denali and then Mount Blanc. So I want to try and do Hood, Baker, Shasta, Whitney, now Adam, that we talked about that one, maybe even Mount St. Helens, Rainier, and partner all those in prep for an attempt at Denali in June, around that time frame. And then possibly an attempt at Mount Blanc in September timeframe, around there. So that'll get me upwards of, 4 of the 7 summits, and then hopefully finish off the 58 14ers next year, probably around summer, fall timeframe, and then just have the PCT left, and then the other 3 massive summits of the 7. Because the ultimate goal is to do the 7 summits, Triple Crown, and then all 58 Colorado 14ers. Because usually, like, mountaineers aren't hikers, hikers aren't mountaineers. It kind of doesn't translate the same way. Typically, some people are interested in doing Everest or some of these other Vincent Massif, some of the other tougher climbs. But that definitely is on my radar for sure. So that's what I'm looking at. That's like the 5-year plan, I guess.
I'm looking forward to seeing what the rest of this year brings, and then what 2025 and the future holds for you. You've been truly an inspiration to talk to, and I think we could do a second episode on just things that we weren't able to cover on the AT, the CDT, and especially Kilimanjaro coming up. That would be an exciting conversation as well. This last portion of the podcast, Stephen, is the this or that questions. They're all hiking related, and you just choose which one you would prefer out of the 2. Now, sometimes you can't choose. You can say both or neither. But the first one is, do you prefer hiking in the summer or in the fall?
Fall. For sure the fall. Yeah, without a doubt. Summer is it depends on where you're at, I guess, in the summer, but it gets hot. I'm not a big fan of heat. I'm more a big fan of the cold, for sure. So fall, and the colors, that you get, just the weather, everything. It's pretty majestic, I think. So fall.
Especially in Colorado.
Yeah, with everything that turns, leaves, the different leaf peeping.
And I think I know the answer to this next one, but waterfalls or summits?
Summits. Hands down. Summits. Yeah. Although waterfalls are awesome too. I mean, there were some really amazing ones in Glacier National Park. There's like this 1,000-foot waterfall that I saw coming off one of the side of the peaks. If you didn't stop and, just kind of like look around, I would have totally missed it. I don't even know why I stopped to begin with, but I just happened to stop, and I was, turned my head to the left, and sure enough, I saw like this white streak going down the side of the rock. And I was like, man, that looks like snow and ice. And then I kind of, squinted my eyes a little bit, and I'm like, oh my God, that's a waterfall. And sure enough, it was like 1,000 feet in the air. It's crazy.
And then we kind of touched base on this between the East Coast and the West Coast hiking, but do you prefer switchbacks, or would you rather go straight up?
So I think if it's like snow and ice and glaciated, I would rather go straight up. If it's not, and it's just rock or scree or a regular trail, yeah, I would much rather switchbacks and straight up, if that makes sense.
And then this one's the most controversial one, Stephen, but trek poles or freehand?
I had never used trekking. So, ruck marching in the Army, you don't get to use trekking poles. And then when I finally used them, when I started training for the AT, I was like, how did I ever walk without these to begin with? Like, every human should have trekking poles coming out of the crib, because they just help so much easier. But now I'm getting to the point that I'm actually carrying them more that I'm using them, if that makes sense. Like I'll use them sometimes going up really steep pitches or when I'm descending down a steep pitch. But the majority of the time, if I'm just walking, I'm holding them either in my right or my left hand. I'm not really using them that much anymore. Like back on the AT, I was using them like every step, every movement, it was using a trekking pole. But now I'm just kind of getting into a groove where I'm not using them as much. And believe it or not, I've talked to a couple people that have gone to Everest Base Camp or done some treks out in Nepal and whatnot. And Sherpas encourage you not to use them because it conserves more energy if you're not using them.
Oh, that's right. Yeah, I forgot what the statistic is, but like using trek poles, you actually burn more calories.
Yeah, you do. I'm trying to focus that on how I'm walking and carrying trekking poles and doing that more versus, like a maniac out there just chomping away on trekking poles, jabbing them into the ground and trying to go as fast as I can because it wastes energy.
And then this next one's about your footwear, more specifically about hiking and through hiking, but trail runners or hiking boots?
Oh man, this is such a controversial topic too. I'll try and make this as quick as possible. I have a very horrid history with trail runners, specifically a name brand that's very popular that's a zero drop. I'm not going to drop their name here, but I'll just say that my feet were not a fan of them. I was wearing the wrong size for my feet too, because when I finally got to Franklin, North Carolina, I got my feet sized, and there's a gear shop there that really knows what they're doing when it comes to footwear. So if you're on the AT, definitely stop in there. But he sized my foot and he told me where I needed to be wearing versus what I was wearing. And I sized up. It was almost like 2 sizes bigger than what I was normally wearing. It was a game changer for my arches. It really helped out. But I went to Hoka in PA. I went through Topo, Ultra, and finally settled on Hoka. It just seems to fit my foot the best, but they run out quick. I mean, all these shoes do too. Ultras, Lone Peaks, they usually last maybe 400 or 500 miles, and then you got to get a new pair. I mean, a lot of these shoes aren't built they say they're built for through hiking, but the ruggedness of it and how many miles you're putting in there, they go pretty quick. So I've settled on Hoka Anacapa GTX. It's a trail runner, but in a high top, and it's Gore-Tex. You can use it in the winter or just going through streams, and it's not going to get too wet and keeps your feet dry. So that's the shoe that I've pretty much settled on.
Now, this next one, Stephen, is it involves trail systems, but for a day hike, would you prefer a loop trail or an out and back trail?
If the view is awesome on the loop, I'm doing the loop. If the views are better on the out and back, I would do the out and back.
When it comes to trail system conditions, if you had to choose between these two, which one would you choose? A muddy trail or a rocky trail?
Oh God, not a muddy trail. Definitely a rocky trail. I had so much fun, and everyone talks a lot of ish about PA because of the rocks, but personally, I loved it. I thought it was so much fun. And then climbing out here in Colorado, seeing the different rocky environments out here as well. I don't mind rocky trails. They're fine. I like bouldering. I like scrambling. I don't mind it. I hate mud. Vermont was by far the worst state for me mentally. I wanted to be done with the trail at that point because it rained for weeks on end and it was just muddy. It was just miserable. You're just wet, dirty. It's just awful. So definitely rocky over muddy.
And then these next two are the hardest ones, but sunset hikes or sunrise hikes?
That is a hard one. Probably sunrise, I think. I personally think that you get more of the alpine glow in the sunrise versus the sunset because the sun might not be on the peaks when it's setting, or it could be, and it could be the same way on the sunrise too, but that golden hour between dawn and when the sun is completely up, there are so many views of alpine glow that you can get just out in the environment. It is such an awesome phenomenon to see that. And if you're there on the summit for a sunrise, while the sun is coming up, the mountain will cast a shadow on the valley below, and it goes into a point, like almost a pyramid type kind of shadow that it casts on the valley. And seeing that is phenomenal. You get that only on a sunrise.
I think that response might be converting some people, Stephen.
But the flip side is, though, you have to get up super early to make it to the summit of a sunrise. So if you want to be, depending on your speed, if you want to be up there, sometimes you got to start at 2 or 3 in the morning. Versus for a sunset, you can walk all day and then just set up your tent, be good to go. There's pros and cons.
Now, if you had to choose spring wildflowers or fall colors?
Fall colors, I think. They just pop better for me.
And then I'm interested in this one because you've done both. But if you had to choose between a steep climb or long distance, which one you going with?
Oh man, I love steep climbs, but I hate steep descents. There's been times where I'm going up a steep climb and I think to myself, I still have to get back down this thing somehow. And I'm not a very good down climber. It's one of my things that I really need to work on when I start branching out into technical climbs. I need to get better at that. But yeah, I like steep climbs. They're fun, but not a steep descent. Long climbs, I'm not a big fan of. Like there are some that we did were like 4 and 5% grade, but it's over, 10 or 12 miles and you gain 4 and 5,000 feet. I'm like, just do the 4 and 5,000. Just get me up there. Just do it in 6 miles. I'm on the summit, and then let me get on my day. So I'm not a big fan of long climbs. They drag on for some reason. For me, mentally.
Well, that was it, Stephen, for the this or that questions. It has been amazing talking to you. For folks that want to follow your adventures and see some of your previous adventures on the CDT AT Colorado Trail, where can they find you online, whether it's on social media or on website?
Yeah, sure. So on social media, I'm on Insta. It's Paul_Bunyan_214. I know I have like 3 pseudonames. I have my real name, a trail name near miss, and then I use Paul Bunyan on Insta. But I did it because I knew I was going to grow a beard. So I wanted to kind of have that handle on there. And then on Facebook, Stephen Palazzo, Palazzo. And then on LinkedIn, same thing, Palazzo. I'm in the process of getting a website going for what I'm trying to accomplish, the 7 summits, the 58 14ers, and then Triple Crown, and kind of naming it 7583. So there's some of that going on. Hopefully, maybe next time we talk, that'll be up and running, and people can check that out as well. And I want to get a YouTube channel going, but I'm just so lazy editing footage that I haven't branched out into that yet. So I have one, but there's only a few videos on there.
Well, we'll be sure to link both your Insta, your Facebook, and LinkedIn in the episode show notes so people can check it out. And then, once you get that website up and running, let me know, and we can always add it to the episode show notes on the next episode or on this one as well. But Stephen, it's been a blast talking to you, man. You're truly an inspiration for the things that you're doing, and really thankful for you to come on the podcast and share your experiences with not just me, but the community as well.
Yeah, I really appreciate it. Thanks for taking the time and having me on here. I appreciate what you do for the hiking community as well, and getting the stories of us out there so that people can go out and find their own adventures and do their own stuff too. So really appreciate it. Awesome being on. It was so much fun.
And that brings us to the end of this episode alongside Stephen. We extend a heartfelt thanks to him for coming on the podcast. Make sure to follow his adventures on Instagram at Paul_Bunyan_214. Also, don't forget to check out the episode show notes to learn more. We have an incredible lineup of episodes planned throughout the fall months, and we can't wait to share them with you. New episodes will be dropping every Monday, with occasional bonus episodes on Fridays. To ensure that you never miss out on those thrilling tales, remember to hit the like and subscribe button. Your support means the world to us. Don't forget to join our vibrant community on Instagram at Hikes and Mics. We'll be sharing episode visuals, my own personal hiking content, and so much more. Let's stay connected and continue to inspire each other on this remarkable journey. As we bid farewell, remember to tread those happy trails, embrace the great outdoors, and keep the spirit of adventure alive. Until next time, my fellow explorers, happy hiking. This episode's music was created by Ketsa. Follow him on Instagram at Ketsa Music. Hey everyone, hope you've all been enjoying the trails this summer. I gotta be honest, leading group hikes is a blast, but capturing all the amazing memories can be a challenge. That's where our new podcast sponsor, the Cameo Journal, comes in. This thing's built for travelers and hikers by fellow adventurers. It's a pocket-sized rugged journal designed for you to collect up to 100 entries from all your trail mates, your life guests, and anyone else you meet along the way. Basically, it can be a guest book for your travels and an awesome keepsake. Logan over at the Cameo Journal is a backpacker himself and put all his love for travel into the design. So if you're looking to level up your hiking adventures, head over to thecameojournal.com to grab one not just for yourself, but for your crew too.